Thank you. I am
Please.
Donna Kane, and I'm the chairwoman for TTN Ohio. And we've got many friends here from all over the United States. So thank you for coming to be with us. Um, I'm not going to make any announcements, so I'll just pass it over to Mary, and she'll speak for a few minutes to introduce David Meyers, and then he'll talk for, I think, till maybe 6:40, 7:45, and we'll have question and answers. And write down your questions so that you can ask them. Okay, Mary, go ahead. Thanks.
Um, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker for tonight. I've had the opportunity to hear him twice before at other groups, and so I thought he would be a great speaker for TTN. David is a lifelong resident of Columbus, Ohio, and he's a graduate of Miami University and Ohio State University. He's been interested in history since childhood, and that interest led him to write a number of nonfiction books on a variety of topics, many of which have been neglected by other historians. He's also authored several novels and a handful of works for the stage, including 2 full-length musicals. In 2019, David was inducted into the Ohio Senior Citizens Hall of Fame in recognition of his work. He frequently collaborates with his daughter, Elise Meyers Walker, who might be joining him a little later at question and answer time. She's a graduate of Hofstra University and Ohio University. Among their many books are Wicked Columbus, Ohio, Inside the Ohio Penitentiary, Historic Black Settlements of Ohio, Kahiki Supper Club, Ohio Jazz, and a number of others. I know you will find his talk on the reverse underground in Ohio both educational and enjoyable. David, welcome to TTN. We are excited to hear your talk.
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. And thank you for your introduction, Mary. This is what, the 4th time now you've introduced me. Mary belongs to a lot of clubs. My daughter, Elise, who is here with me, is just handling the tech mostly because she's got a cold she's struggling with. So that will determine whether she talks to you later or not. People ask us, how did a father and daughter start writing together? I've always written something, and Elise, I didn't know if she was really interested in writing it at all, but when she went off to Hofstra, her roommate was the editor of the Hofstra Chronicle newspaper. And at the time, Elise was in the drama program, and he asked her to write reviews for the Chronicle. And so she started doing that. But about the same time, she became friends with a woman on Long Island who had her own children's theater company. And so Elise was acting in these plays for children all over New York on the weekends and things. And that woman also, she's a very interesting woman, very dynamic. She's making movies now, but she had started a magazine called Teen Trend. And she needed somebody to write articles and take photographs for that. So she hired Elise to do that. And then she added another magazine. So Elise wrote articles for that. So by the time she graduated from Hofstra, she had done a fair amount of writing. And I was trying to think of some way to maintain close relationship with Elise. And so I suggested, why don't we write a book together? And she agreed. And we started out doing that. And, obviously it's worked out because we've done, 16 or so books together by now, all of them local histories. And generally it's just the two of us. But when we did the Lazarus book, her mother also was involved. And we've also brought in other authors who were kind of subject matter experts when we tackle various things, but primarily it's the two of us writing these. So that's how that began. And as a result, we bring two different perspectives to whatever project we're working on. And I particularly enjoy it when we're doing book shows and Elise is there because, you know, you've got the young girls coming up to her who want to be writers, and you can pick them out of the crowd. You know which ones they are. But they wouldn't be coming up to me and asking me about it, but they're going to go ask her. So I'm glad that she's there for that. The subject I'm going to be talking about tonight, the reverse Underground Railroad. Everybody's practically heard by now of the Underground Railroad. Most have not heard about the reverse Underground Railroad. So I'll get that out of the way right from the beginning. The reverse Underground Railroad was the network of slave hunters and slave owners that went in search of fugitive slaves. And they could come into Ohio and any other state in the Union because the Constitution allowed that. Even though we were a free state and you weren't allowed to have slaves in Ohio, the law allowed them to come here looking for their property, and the slaves were still considered property. So the reverse Underground Railroad is looking at it through the perspective of slave hunters. Yeah, I'm going to have Elise switch me over now so you can see the screen.
Hi, I'm here. I'm spending all my energy trying to breathe.
Okay.
And you're gonna want me to move this, right? Because you wanna.
I can see that.
But you want to read your notes.
Okay.
All right. Well, there's your bit.
So
I'm still here again, still trying to breathe.
So you should now see a screen that says the Reverse Underground Railroad in Ohio by David Meyers and Elise Myers Walker. And I'm going to start out by reading this statement from Aristotle, which he wrote back in 330 BCE for the Common Era. It is clear then that some men are by nature free and others slaves, and that for these latter slavery is both expedient and right. Now, when you think of it, when our nation was formed, what people aspired to was a classical education. And a classical education was studying the wisdom handed down by such people as Aristotle and other philosophers and Pythagoras and other mathematicians. The classical education was learning to read Greek and Latin so that you could absorb this knowledge. And in this, embodied in this, was the idea that being free and being a slave were two natural states. And if you were a slave, that's what you were supposed to be. And so you should accept that. And so that's where all the problems started with, is that from the beginning, slavery was viewed as a natural state for some people. You just hoped that you weren't one of them. Yeah, Elise, how do I get it to go?
It's there. You just click your next.
The
arrow.
I did.
Arrow.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Okay.
Should I just, you're gonna have to highlight next, I think.
Okay. Okay. Just learning how to operate this. Most people don't realize that the word slave was derived from the word Slav, as in the Slavic people. During the Middle Ages, most slaves in Europe and the Islamic world were people from Slavic Eastern Europe. It was only in the 15th century that slavery became linked with people from the sub-Saharan Africa. Slavery is addressed in both the Bible and the Quran. International slave trade can be traced back to the early 7th century, 1,000 years before the founding of the United States. Who participated in slavery? Well, Muslims enslaved people, Vikings enslaved people, and then they would trade. Native Americans enslaved people. They had already started enslaving people before the Europeans ever arrived in the United States, or what became the United States. The Spanish enslaved people, the British enslaved people. By the time we get to the transatlantic slave trade, in which these European countries were going to Africa and obtaining Africans to sell in the slave trade, this is the way it flowed across the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean. You can see all the different routes that were taken to the New World, which would be North and South America. I've written 3% there because if you follow the arrows, only 3% of the slaves, of the people who were captured in Africa and taken to the New World, actually ended up in North America. So it was only a small percentage of the total slave trade. It's estimated that 12.5 million Africans were exported from Africa by the countries of Portugal, Britain, Spain, France, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Africa to the New World. Of that, 388,000 actually made it to the United States. The rest went, as you saw on those arrows, all over, from Central America to Southern America and to the islands. So we only got this small fraction, 3% of the total number of slaves. However, what we engaged in was called chattel slavery, and that's our permanent stain upon U.S. history. Chattel slavery is basically you owning slaves for life, and you own their children as well. Most types of slavery that were practiced in the world, there was usually a term of service for a slave. And for many of them, their children were not enslaved. But in chattel slavery, there was no term of service. It was forever. And they also would enslave the children. So that's what made it particularly egregious. However, as I point out, there are both heroes and villains in the story. And some of them were both. Some villains became heroes. It's a very complicated issue. And I think one of the problems we have is we don't appreciate how complicated it was. The struggle to abolish slavery began even before there was a United States. And then when we reached the Civil War, 750,000 soldiers died in order to free the slaves. As a result, 4 million slaves were freed. So we went from having 388,000 slaves to 4 million. How did that happen? It was primarily through natural breeding by the enslaved people. And this was kind of unique in the United States in that those who were sent to like the islands in the Caribbean and things, the ones that were sent to the sugar plantations and places like that to work, they didn't produce children. Most of them died very young. They were just worked to death. Whereas in the United States, slaves often did have families, often did have children. So it was an entirely different environment for them here than it was there. Because of what was going on in the United States and the backlash against slavery, we started changing our laws. Once we started flexing our own muscle and becoming our own country, a confederation of colonies, we passed the Northwest Ordinance. And that was on July 13th, 1787. That was the first real document that indicated how this new government in the United States, or in the colonies, was going to operate. The first thing that it did was significant is it prohibited slavery in new states that were going to be made out of the Northwest Territory. Ohio was one of those states. So that's why we were banned from having slaves from the beginning. Also, they continued the practice of allowing runaway slaves to be pursued, even in free states. So those were the two significant things that came out of the Northwest Ordinance. 2 years later, we wrote our Constitution, which is our first overall governing document. One of the things that's important in the Constitution, which incidentally doesn't ever mention slaves directly, except that it indicates that no new slaves will be imported as of 1808. So you see in the US Constitution, the first stab that our country had at creating a document governing how the United States was going to function, they already were banning slaves for the further importation of slaves in 1808. So 20 years later, they would no longer allow slaves to be imported. However, after that, there were other laws passed. There were interpretations of those laws as they were processed through the courts. And so there were a number of changes to slavery that took place during the antebellum or pre-Civil War era. So the first big act, and this is coming out of the Constitution, was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. This affirmed the right of slave owners to pursue their slaves into free states. It also levied a $500 fine against anyone who interfered with the slaveholders' rights to capture their slaves. So if you did something, if you hid the slave, if you gave him a ride, if you did anything to interfere with the slaveholders recapturing that individual, you could be fined $500. And it also stated that it was the local government's responsibility. So it was the responsibility of the local justices within the state to not legislate, but make rulings governing all the cases of fugitive slaves that were brought before them. So it wasn't a federal issue. 1803 was the year Ohio became a state. And this is a map showing you what the United States looked like in 1803. And you can see the northern states, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, New England, everything except Maine. And then the southern states of Kentucky, Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, down through Georgia. Those were the southern states where the slaves were. And then we had these territories, Indiana Territory in the yellow up above, Mississippi down below. In the area that says Indiana Territory was the Northwest Territory. And that was the remainder of the land that was going to be divided up into states under as part of the Northwest Territory. So that was kind of the starting point of our country. What we have here, these red lines, are the supposed Underground Railroad lines. Now, anytime you hear that, you have to think in a soft terms, because these weren't hard and fast routes. The routes were subject to changing on the whim. And the reason for that is it wouldn't take the slave catchers very long to learn the routes that people were being transported along in the Underground Railroad. So you had to improvise as you were going along. So these red lines indicate roughly the way people were being fugitive slaves were being transported north to Canada, but it's not hard and fast. But the important part of this particular diagram is just showing you how much of that activity took place in Ohio. Ohio was ground zero for the Underground Railroad. I mean, it stretched all the way up into New England and out as far as Illinois and Missouri, but most of the activity was right through Ohio. And that's because, it was a short distance from the Ohio River to Canada. You just get beyond Toledo and you're in Canada. So that's what made it so important. And that's why we had more fugitive slave traffic through Ohio and more Underground Railroad stations and more abolitionists assisting the fugitive slaves. I'm going to tell you about some of these cases to give you an idea, not only the variations in the type of fugitives we were dealing with, but also how it changed over time. And that's what I keep trying to emphasize, is that the situation that the fugitive slave was dealing with in 1803 was entirely different from the situation he was dealing with in 1850. It was worse. So the first one we're going to talk about was a man named Abraham, and this was in Ross County, which is where Chillicothe is located, which is where the original seat of government was in Ohio. And the year was 1801. And Abraham escaped from one of the original settlers in Ohio, who, along with Thomas Worthington and a handful of others, basically created the state of Ohio. And Nathaniel Massey was that individual's name. This was the situation. Abraham had been brought to Ohio from Virginia. He was brought here as a slave. Once he was in Ohio, he couldn't be a slave. That was against the law. There was a ruling at the time, or a law in Ohio, that you, if you wanted your slave to be an indentured servant, first you had to give him his freedom. And then, if he agreed to be an indentured servant, you would sign an indentured agreement, and it would stipulate how long you were going to work for him and what, if any, remuneration you would get, and that kind of thing. Maybe a trade you would learn, whatever. But what Massey did was he didn't agree to free Abraham until Abraham agreed to become an indentured servant. So he violated the law. The interesting thing about being an indentured servant is 2/3 of the colonists were indentured servants. Probably some of your ancestors, depending upon them when they arrived, came here as indentured servants. That was a standard way of getting from the old world to the new. If you were a poor person, couldn't afford to pay your own passage, you would assign an indentured agreement with someone who did have the money, and they would bring you over. And you might work for them for 7 years, and then you are free to pursue the rest of your life. What happened with Abraham is, after he became an indentured servant against his will, he ran away, and it didn't take long before he was jailed. And once he was put into jail, they hired him out to work. And the reason they did that is it was customary during this period of time for a prisoner to have to pay for his own jail expenses. So what the sheriff at the time would do is find places for his inmates to work, and then he would collect the money and apply that against the expenses of keeping them in jail. The resolution on this was Nathaniel Massey was contacted by the sheriff. He went to where Abraham was being held, or he didn't go, but he sent his messengers there with his paperwork, proved his ownership or his indentureship, and they took him back to Russ County. Abraham returned to the same place he was living before, and it's noted that the housing he was in was very similar to the slave housing that they had in Virginia. Thomas Worthington did the same thing. He built these houses that looked like slave houses right behind his wonderful manse in Chillicothe called Adena, but it looked just like a Southern plantation. So we don't know what happened to Nathaniel Massey after that. However, we do know that Thomas Worthington in particular had promised his former slaves that if they would agree to be indentured servants for him and work to help him build his new estate, that he would eventually give them their own plots of land. He never did that. He never followed through on his agreement. So we've got the rules established that you can still come to Ohio and capture fugitive slaves. There became a concern, because Ohio was a free state, that it would become a magnet for people of color. And so the legislature in Ohio started passing laws. These were called the Black Laws. There was a group of them in 1804, another group in 1807. What these Black Laws did is they required any new person of color who came to Ohio had to register with the local seat of government. He also had to post a $500 bond, which in today's money would be about $13,000, which was a promise not to be a problem, not to break any laws. He also had to obtain a certificate of freedom, a document to prove that he was free and not a fugitive slave. And when he'd done this, he still couldn't vote, and he still couldn't testify in court. So he was basically, he wasn't a citizen of the United States. He lived here, but he occupied a lower status. The thing about these Black Laws is Ohio was the first one to establish them, but other states started passing them too. Indiana passed them, Illinois passed them, several others, because there was this fear that they were all going to be overrun by people of color who would come up from the South. Here's one of the first fugitive slave stories that we have, and it concerns a woman named Jane who lived in Virginia before it was Virginia, on the plantation of a family named Tomlinson. And this was in 1808. And Joseph Tomlinson's father and his brothers and his son owned several large pieces of land on the eastern side of the Ohio River, and had a number of slaves there, and Jane was one of them. Well, in this situation, 1808, Jane ran away and stole $4, which, was some money, $100 or so at that time. She was captured, jailed, tried, and sentenced to hang. And that was a law that had actually been passed fairly recently there. But while she was in jail, waiting the gallows, she struck up conversations with a sympathetic guard. and he eventually allowed her, opened the door and allowed her to slip away. So she came across the Ohio River, married, had children, lived here for several years. But the thing about slave owners is they had long memories, and they viewed, this as lost money. The wealth in the, half the wealth in the South was slaves. It was better than money in the bank. So you weren't going to let this money get away from you. And so he hired some slave catchers and sent them to Ohio to find Jane. She was found, arrested, returned to Virginia, even though she had a family and children and things. And she was still facing being hanged for having stolen $4. Well, the governor decided to give her a reprieve, save her from being hanged. All that did was allow her owner to sell her back into slavery. And so she ended up probably in a worse situation than she was originally. And we don't know what happened to her after that. She just kind of disappears from history. The Tomlinsons don't though. Uh, we'll be mentioning them in our next book. Here's one of my stories that has kind of engrossed me since I was a kid when I first read about it in a publication of the Ohio Historical and Archaeological Society. This was an individual named Jerry Finney, and it took place in Columbus in 1846. And Jerry was a Black man who had escaped from an owner in Kentucky named Bathsheba D. Long. The way Jerry came to Ohio is his owner had basically rented him out to someone else, and that person brought him to Ohio to perform some work on some land along the Ohio River. This was quite common. Even though we were not a slave state, it wasn't unusual for people who lived in Kentucky, but also owned land in Ohio, to bring their slaves across the river and have them farm that land. It wasn't legal, but it was such a sparsely populated area at that time, they could do it kind of with impunity and knowing that they weren't going to be caught. So Jerry was brought over here to do some work, and he took the opportunity to escape. And he came up north, settled in Columbus, and he too started a family. And Jerry became very well known in the Columbus area. He did a lot of jobs. He was a waiter. He worked at hotels. People in the State House knew Jerry. I think he shined shoes maybe too. But as I said, he became a well-known personality in the Columbus area over the course of 10 years or so. Well, finally, Jerry was tracked to Columbus. And what the slave hunter did is, at that time, since it was a local issue, if you captured somebody and accused them of being a fugitive slave, you had to take them between a judge or justice of the peace. And what they did then was they did judge shopping, because they could determine whether or not a judge was pro-slavery or anti-slavery. Because even though we were a free state, there were a lot of pro-slavery people who lived in Ohio, and some of them held responsible positions. So they located a judge in Franklinton, which was, a suburb of Columbus, just on the west side of the river downtown. They lured Jerry to the office of this judge under the pretense that a wedding was going to be performed there, and they need him to haul a trunk that the newlywed couple were going to be taking on their trip. Well, once he got over to Franklinton and went into the office, the lights went out, he got jumped, and then they drugged him and they hurried him outside and put him in a carriage and started transporting him to Columbus. Well, Jerry hadn't gone to the office by himself. He brought a young man with him, a boy, I think, maybe 14 or so. And he was held captive for like 3 hours to give Jerry a head start, or Jerry's captors a head start in getting away. But then they turned him loose, and he went and told everybody he could find that Jerry had been kidnapped. And the citizens of Columbus, were in an uproar immediately because Jerry was such a popular character. And so somebody got his fastest horses and gave it to these young men who hopped the horses and went tearing out after Jerry and his kidnappers. And they chased him, I think, as far as Xenia, where he got on a train, and the train went down to the Ohio River, and they chased after it, and they got there just after Jerry was put into a boat and taken across the Ohio River. So Jerry had been captured, was taken to Kentucky to face a judge being an escaped slave. He was tried in Kentucky and found guilty of being a fugitive slave. No surprise there. They usually were. However, the citizens of Columbus came up with this idea. Let's buy Jerry from his owner and bring him back to Columbus and turn him loose. So they raised $550, which is what the owner agreed to accept. And they got him released from prison and brought him back to Columbus. Unfortunately, prisons were pretty terrible at that time. Jerry had been there a number of months under miserable conditions and ended up dying of tuberculosis not long after he arrived back in Columbus. So a lot of fugitive slave stories, there's many out of them out there, and we cover a lot of them in the book, but that's kind of the way they progressed. But it was all taking place on a local level. So there's a lot of local shenanigans taking place. However, the slave owners felt that they were losing an awful lot of slaves, that they were making it into Ohio and other northern states and being helped to escape to Canada, or maybe just to Michigan, or maybe just to Ohio. And they pressured the federal government to do something about it. They say, we're losing too many of our slaves, which is their, wealth. And so in 1850, to appease the vocal group slave owners, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And it reinforced the right for slave owners to pursue slaves. However, this now, instead of being fined $500 if you interfered, now it was a federal law that you could be required to assist in capturing the fugitive slave. And also, it was the federal government's responsibility to hear these cases. So it went from being a local matter to a federal matter, and you did not have a choice whether to participate in tracking down these slaves. So up to this point, you had three groups of people. You had people that were for slavery, people who were against slavery, and a large group in the middle who didn't really care because it didn't really bother them. Well, now they found themselves being forced, or potentially being forced, to assist in capturing fugitive slaves. And that was taking it too far for these people. And so there's a lot of anger about this. So we're going to talk about another slave case that took place in Columbus. A young woman named Rosetta Armstead, and this was in 1855. And she escaped from Reverend Henry Dennison, who lived in Kentucky. Now, the number of ministers who owned slaves is kind of incredible, and you don't know how they really reconciled that, but they did. And so there was a lot of people who were viewed as being very pious individuals who were also slaveholders. Rosetta was actually the slave of the minister's wife, but the minister's wife had died. And so Rosetta was taking care of the daughter or the child of the minister and his late wife. Well, he had sent the daughter back to Virginia to be cared for by his family. And he decided that Rosetta should also join her. And so he arranged for a family friend to transport Rosetta from Kentucky to Virginia. And they did this via steamboat. So they boarded the boat in Ohio River. However, there was heavy ice due to the time of the year. And so by the time they got as far north as Cincinnati, the ice prohibited the steamboat from going any farther. So they had to disembark on the wharf in Cincinnati. So once they were there, they caught a train and came to Columbus. And on the train, Rosetta happened to talk to some people who were abolitionists. I believe they were African Americans. And she didn't know much about freedom or the possibility of freedom. And so they filled her in as quickly as they could. And so once she reached Columbus, they decided that they were going to do what they could to help her gain her freedom. So they identified her as a slave. And because she was in Ohio and not with her owner, they made the argument that the owner had allowed her to come to Ohio, so now she was freed. So they took custody of her, took possession of Rosetta, and the minister Denison came to Columbus to try to induce her to return. And he said that he told her that he'd respect her decision, and she refused to go back with him. So instead, he had her arrested, even though he said he wouldn't do anything. And her case was heard in the U.S. District Court and the U.S. Circuit Court. And she was declared to be a free young Black woman. It just so happened there was a woman passing through Columbus at the time from New England who was very wealthy, and she took an interest in the case. And she arranged to take Rosetta back to New England with her and paid for her to obtain schooling there. And some years later, Rosetta did come back to Columbus and visit and thank people who had been involved in her rescue. Margaret Garner is one of the most famous cases you've ever heard of, if you've heard of it at all, ever heard of, because Toni Morrison novelized this story in her book Beloved, and which was made into a movie. But this took place in 1856, and is really an extremely tragic story. Margaret escaped from an owner named Archibald K. Gaines. And she and her husband and her 4 children and her in-laws made their way to Cincinnati. And it was kind of involved, but they're very resourceful people. And once they reached Cincinnati, she took them to her cousin, Joe Kite's house, thinking that he would be able to help them continue on north. However, while they were at Joe Kite's, slave catchers discovered them and they were captured. Margaret, who was pregnant, decided on the spur of the moment right then to kill herself and her children. And so she drew a knife and started slashing them. And she did manage to kill her 2-year-old daughter, Mary, before she was overpowered and the knife was taken away from her. but she was determined that she and her children would not be returned to slavery. So they had a trial, a hearing for Margaret, and it lasted 2 weeks, which was an unusually long time for these things. Usually they were pretty cut and dried, but this one had some interesting twists and turns. It was argued by the defense that Margaret was free because she had previously been brought to Ohio. And that was a rule that was kind of in the making at the time, based upon several court decisions, that if you're the owner brought a person, their slave, into Ohio, they should automatically be freed because they've been brought to a free state. They lost that argument. Then Plan B was defense decided that they would try to have her charged with murder of her 2-year-old Mary. And the reason for this is because they were pretty sure that if she were convicted, she wouldn't be executed because there would be such sympathy for her, and that eventually she would be able to be paroled from prison. So that was a chance she was willing to take. She said she'd rather, hang in Ohio than go back down to Kentucky. But they didn't win on that one either. So the judge ruled that she should go back to Kentucky, and she did. And then she was sold down south. And sold down south meant down the Mississippi River, usually to work in the cane fields in Louisiana. And that was, certain death. Slaves who were worked down in those areas had very short lives. As it turned out, on the trip down the Ohio River, the steamboat collided with a log or something, and she and one of her kids were thrown into the Ohio River. And once again, she tried to drown the child and herself, but was stopped from doing so. So she was brought back on the ship, on the steamboat, taken back down to the plantation, and she died of typhoid fever in 1858. And we know this because her husband survived. And so he lived to tell her tale. The Oberlin Wellington rescue is also a very famous fugitive slave story. It involved a man named John Price, and it took place in Oberlin in 1859. John Price was a former slave who'd escaped from Anderson Jennings down in Kentucky. He lived in the Maysville area. Not only was he a slave owner, but he was a very well-known and feared slave hunter. So he was one of these people who would roam through Ohio looking for anybody that he suspected might possibly be a slave. And he would then kidnap them and take them to court and hope that the judge would rule in his favor, even if he didn't have much to go on. Because once you got a black person of color down below the Mason-Dixon line, chances are you would be able to sell them as a slave, whether they'd been a slave or not. So John Price made his way to the Oberlin area when he escaped and was living there. And Oberlin had a neighborhood just outside of it that was made up largely of fugitive slaves, had their own community. So John Price, he was from Maysville and got arrested in Oberlin, Ohio. The U.S. Marshal took Price to Wellington, which was another town up in that area. Because this was after the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, U.S. Marshals were now required to search for fugitive slaves. Some of them hated that aspect of their jobs and resigned. They refused to be used for that purpose. Others embraced it because they could earn a lot of money capturing fugitive slaves, additional income to what they're receiving as U.S. Marshals. So they took him to Wellington, put him up in a hotel, and planned to put him on a train to Columbus. However, when word got out in Oberlin that John Price had been taken by slave hunters, a large crowd of abolitionists got together and made their way to Wellington. And they surrounded the hotel and trapping the abolitionists and John Price inside. They stormed the hotel, rescued Price, smuggled him to Canada. However, the slave owners then pressed charges against these individuals who had interfered with their attempt to reclaim John Price. And 37 abolitionists were arrested. 12 of them were Black. 35 were released subsequently. 2 were tried. 1 of them was Black. The jury were all known Democrats. And at the time, the Democrats were almost all pro-slavery. Republican Party basically was born to overturn slavery. So in one of the jurors was also one of the men that was involved in kidnapping Price. So they weren't particular about the people's connections to this case. But anyhow, the 2 men that were tried were convicted, but the judge was sympathetic and gave them light sentences. So they only served a few weeks. Yes. So this was the United States during the Civil War. Just to show you how it had changed from 1803. Is there a way, how do I turn on the, I don't know, I think somebody tried to say something. We're trying to, I think somebody was trying to say something to me. I want to find out what it is.
No, I didn't see anything.
Okay. Guess I misheard. I will continue. So this shows you how the United States had grown during the Civil War. And, there were more northern states, more southern states, a lot of wheeling and dealing took place to try to maintain a balance between free states and slave states. And that determined which states came in which order and this kind of things, which is all kind of fascinating. But it was all a matter of trying to maintain control, the same control of the government that you had before. This actually is the illustration we used on the cover of the book. And what it shows is this is what the situation was after Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And you can see the man in the middle is holding a document that says, "No interference with slave hunters." And this shows just basically how divided the country was. I like to introduce some point during the presentation this picture of Fanny Virginia Cassiopeia Lawrence. And she was one of several poster children for the abolitionist movement. And these were all children that were enslaved down in New Orleans. And the thing about them is they were very, very light skinned. And as a result, they were attracted a lot of attention from people who might have been on the line as far as slavery was concerned, because they would look at a picture of Fanny here and think, she doesn't look too much different than my own daughter. And in some cases, your own daughter may have been darker than she is. And there was a fear, not entirely without merit, that white kids would be kidnapped off the streets by slave hunters and taken down south. And in fact, sometimes that did happen. But for the most part, it didn't. But you did have men who were picked up who were dark complected and accused of being fugitive slaves and taken down south. And so that was started to get people to rethink the whole issue of, light, white and black people. So here's, as I said, these children, they had their photographs taken, and then they would be taken around by the abolitionists to attract attention to their cause. Now, we've been talking a lot about different fugitive slave cases. What I wanted to do, I think it's important, is to see what's available that you can go see to kind of bring these stories to life. And so I want to highlight several structures here that still exist. John Rankin is one of the most famous of the Underground Railroad conductors. He and his family lived down in Ripley, Ohio, and his house is on a bluff overlooking the Ohio River, about 300 feet up. And there's a long stone stairway that leads up to the top where his house stands. And as you can see in this picture, there was an unrestored photo of Rankin's house from about 1930, I believe. And the one up in the upper left-hand corner, the red house, that's what it looks like today. And it's been preserved by Ohio History Center and Higher History Connection. So you can go visit it. And Rankin, if you don't know about him, is a fascinating individual, because even though helping fugitive slaves was against the law, Rankin did it openly, and he didn't care who knew about it. And his whole family was involved. And they just were kind of defiant and challenged people, the slave owners and the marshals and things, to do anything about it. He was a Presbyterian minister from the South, and he had a wife and 13 children helped him with his Underground Railroad activities. And it's estimated that they helped, at least 1,000, maybe a couple thousand fugitive slaves, because Ripley was one of the prime crossing points for the Underground Railroad. And Rankin, the thing is, he was one of the earliest people in making his feelings known about slavery. And he wrote a series of letters to his brother. His brother had purchased some slaves, and John didn't believe in that. So he wrote a series of letters to his brother in which he explained his rationale for why slavery was wrong. And his brother ended up agreeing with him, and the letters were then published and became kind of the Bible for the abolitionist movement. And so Rankin was a very well-known figure, and he was out practically every night helping to fugitive slaves. Another person who was a major name, Levi and Catherine Coffin. Levi was also a minister. He started out in Indiana, started on the Underground Railroad there, and then moved to Cincinnati and became even more involved. Uh, this was his house in Cincinnati. Unfortunately, it's been razed, but his house in Indiana is still standing. But a little bit about Levi and his wife. He was a Quaker, and again, he helped thousands of runaways too. Spent 20 years in Indiana, then moved to Cincinnati in 1847. What he would do is he would help, once they crossed the river into Ohio, fugitive slaves would seek him out because they had heard of him. And he would take them, hide them, and then, in many cases, try to resettle them. And what he would do is he'd take them north on the Miami-Erie Canal up into the area of Mercer and Darke counties. And the reason he would go there is because there were two large historic Black settlements in those areas. The one in Darke County was the Greenville settlement, which was so large that it lapped over the border with Indiana. And then the one in Mercer County was called Carthagena, which was actually the several different communities and was the largest of all these settlements in Ohio. And he would help them to purchase land and and get settled there. They'd build homes, and many there basically remained there until after the Civil War. But Coffin was so instrumental in this idea of setting up camps and getting settlements for the African Americans that when during the Civil War, any fugitive slaves who came in contact with Union troops would usually surrender to them and give themselves up. And they were termed contrabands. And they were contrabands because they occupied this kind of shadowy existence. They weren't citizens yet, and they were still considered property by the South. So it was viewed as contraband property. But they would be given protection by the Union soldiers, and then were set up in resettlement camps. And Levi Coffin was the one who would go around and raise money for these. In fact, he became the Freeman's Agency that developed to deal with all the resettlement of fugitive slaves afterwards. He's the one that basically originated that and became the first person to run it. So he's also been given the title President of the Underground Railroad. Unlike John Rankin, whose letters were written in the 1820s, and he never really wrote about his involvement with the Underground Railroad, that fell to others. Coffin did write about his life and his involvement with the Underground Railroad. So there's a lot of information in his book. Also in Ripley is the home of John P. Parker. And Parker was an African-American former slave who wound up buying his freedom, coming to Ohio, starting a foundry business, getting several patents in the process, becoming quite successful. But he never forgot about the people he left behind when he was formerly a slave. So fortunately, his house in Ripley survived and has now been restored, as you can see in the upper left-hand corner. So you can go see that and learn about him. But we never would have known hardly anything about Parker if he hadn't given an interview late in his life to a newspaper reporter, a detailed interview. Unfortunately, it wasn't published until it was found, in a library, just the notes, like 100 years later. And so it was only then that it came out as a book that we learned all of his activities. But as I said, he was a former slave, fought his freedom. He made numerous trips to Kentucky to rescue slaves. That was something that most Underground Railroad people did not do. He would actually, even though he was African American, cross the Ohio River down into Kentucky and go looking for people to rescue, get them free, help them to escape, and then bring them back to Ohio, and then help them on their way to north. And he too may have rescued as many as 1,000 people during the course of his life. And here's his autobiography. The one is what he dictated to the newspaper man, and it's called His Promised Land. And it is one of the best books in existence now regarding the Underground Railroad. The thing is, we don't know what he looked like. There's a belief. This was this photograph that's here, and you can see the red oval. This is a photograph of a monument dedicated to John Rankin. And Parker and Rankin were friends, and they worked together in the Underground Railroad. That is believed to be Parker in the oval there on the end in this picture. But that's all we know about him. Okay, Elise, you want to come here now?
Yeah, what's up?
So
Am I joining?
that's the presentation that I had. I'd like to open this to questions now. Here's the book. And if you're in Columbus, you can get signed copies of it, the Book Loft in German Village, but you can also buy it on Amazon.com or any other, bookstore that takes orders. So now I thought I'd open it to questions as soon as Elise gets this set up.
We're set up.
Can we just
Okay.
ask? Just go ahead and ask?
Go ahead and ask, yes.
So the one that you talked about at the beginning, that the people in Columbus liked him so much and he went to the State House and they raised all that money.
Yeah, Jerry Finney.
Were they mostly white people that raised all that money?
Yes.
That's what I figured.
Yeah,
Cool.
because they had the money.
Yeah, and they liked
yeah.
him. Well,
yeah. and he, here's the thing. Slaves, had a kind of a natural fit into parts of Northern society because they had been trained to cater to the needs or whims of their Southern owners. So they're very good in the service industry. So they didn't have any trouble finding jobs in hotels as waiters, as barbers. Barbering was a good,
Socially acceptable.
yeah, socially acceptable and a lucrative area for Black men to go into. In fact, the earliest millionaires in the United States were Black men who owned series of barbershops and hotels. So it was, I don't know if you could do that now, but they did back then. So yeah, they fit into these niches, and they not only that, they would squeeze white people out of them because they knew, that's one thing, having been brought up in the South, they knew their place, as far as people prefer to be differential and things and deferential. So they could play that card really well. And so that's why you can imagine how at the State House, catering to all their elected representatives from around the state. Yeah.
Excuse me, the same guy, Jerry, you said he was drugged. What kind of drugs did they use on him? I mean, what would they have had at that time?
I don't really know. It doesn't say what it was. It just said he was drugged. And that is the reason we know that is because on the train, when they put him on the railroad, they took him, there were people who observed him, and they said he appeared to be drugged.
Okay.
But just the way he was moving, and he just seemed to be out of it.
Maybe
So,
chloroform. Didn't they have chloroform at that time? Like they
well,
would
yeah,
put over your face?
yeah. I mean, it could have just been liquor. Who knew? But little things, you know.
Ah. I have another question. I know
Yes.
when the slaves were coming north, wasn't Philadelphia some kind of a safe spot? Because the Quakers in Philly had different ways of handling the fugitives.
The interesting thing is, Pennsylvania was a slave state until up until the 1840s. They had a gradual a law that would gradually freed people who were enslaved, because it originally was a slave state. And so there were a lot of Quakers in Pennsylvania who moved to Ohio to get away from slavery.
Okay.
And yeah. So, but if there any place there was a large concentration of Quakers, was generally speaking a friendly spot
Yeah.
for fugitive slaves. And you think, well, the Quakers were always against slavery. Well, they weren't. They were just the first denomination that recognized that it was wrong, and to get the other members to agree with them to do away with slavery. They started out as slaveholders too.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sure.
Elaine has a question.
Yeah. Elaine?
Yeah, so you call your book Reverse Underground Railroad. I guess I thought you were going to be talking about how the hunters took people back south, put the deck south. But
Yeah.
so
Yeah,
why do you call your book Reverse Underground Railroad?
because basically that's what it is. I didn't go into it much because you really get bogged down the weeds pretty quickly. What the book does is it takes all the iterations of the law from the time the country was founded up until the end of the Civil War, shows how that affected how slaves were treated, fugitive slaves were treated, and the expectations of white people in helping to capture them. And it affected how the slave hunters went about their business. And so it for the first time, because nobody did this before, it shows that when you are a fugitive slave in 1803, it was a different situation than if you were a fugitive slave in 1850, because of what was taking place. And you had the Dred Scott decision in there. And so what I do is I take these cases to show you the variations that take place with each of them in chronologically, but there's a lot of them. And so it would be kind of hard to explain that to anybody in a very short period of time. So I just focused on some of the major fugitive slave cases. But you'll notice they all involved some involvement with the court. Some rung of the court was involved in each of those. And just because that's at one point, you had justices that were basically approving anything. You didn't have to prove he was a slave. He's black, good enough, take him back down. But the law started tightening up, and the people started reacting to really the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, rather than helping to the slave owners regain more slaves, really it turned the tide against them as far as the people in the Union were concerned. All at once, there are far more people against slavery than there had been before. And that's all because of the way the law was being enforced. So I don't know if that helps you or not, but
That's great. I get another question I had was, why was slavery chattel slavery in the U.S.? Why did that occur? Why wasn't it just like slavery everywhere else?
That's an interesting question. You have to look at there's a racial aspect to it that hadn't ever been pursued before. And part of it was you had in Africa, let's say in Africa, slavery existed in Africa before the Europeans went there and started gathering up slaves. They were enslaving each other. When you had, the Dutch and the Spanish and Portuguese going into Africa, all they had to do was strike an agreement with the people that were already enslaving other Africans. And they thought, this shows you how crazy it was. They thought that the Europeans were buying these people to eat.
Oh my God.
Okay? Yeah, they weren't concerned about what was going on. They thought we're going to eat them and we'll sell them to them. So you already had a way of getting slaves out of the deepest parts of Africa. The Europeans weren't going in there. They would have been massacred. So they're dealing with the people that are going in there already. But I think that racial aspect of it was already developing then. And you had a lot, if you look at the science of the time, we were just discovering things like, all these, dark people over there. We were discovering chimpanzees. These were all new things to science, Western science, that were occurring at the same time. And so they were taking, this black man, he's closer to this chimpanzee than he is to us. So he must be a different species. It was kind of that kind of thing was taking place. Science has a lot to answer for, actually, and a lot of the things that developed over the years in our country. But that was one of the things. There was an argument for quite a while. This is a different species. These are subhuman people, or if they're people at all. So that made it easier to enslave them than it was to enslave somebody that looked like you.
Well, Dave, wasn't the Southern economy based on slavery? I mean,
Yeah.
That's what made them wealthy. I mean, because after the war and the slaves were freed, the economy fell. I mean, that became the poor part of the country because they couldn't sustain what they were doing by paying workers.
Yeah, 50% of the wealth in the South was invested in slaves.
Yep.
And they were, you talk about people being, being land rich. Well, they were slave rich. And when the slaves were freed, it was like they took half their money away from them.
I think they took all their money away.
Yeah, well, then they needed somebody to do the work, and they weren't necessarily adept at doing that. Yeah, I mean, it undermined their economy. But de Tocqueville, when he came through, though, he, it made his tour of America. He talked about the difference between the people on the southern side of the Ohio River and on the northern side, and how slavery kind of sapped them of all their initiative. They didn't have to do anything for themselves. Whereas he saw all these prosperous communities on the northern side of the Ohio River, but not on the southern side. And it's still, there's a lot more populated people on the northern side than there is on the southern side of the Ohio River, even though the land and everything's pretty much the same. So yeah, there's a lot of arguments that slavery didn't help them a bit. And there's also these arguments that we'll be addressing more in our next book about how, slavery would eventually die on its own. But those are all being made by people who weren't enslaved. You just wait a while longer. Another 50, 100 years, it'll take care of itself.
I see 6 hands are raised.
Okay. Oh, those are hard to see.
Yeah. So I'm one of them.
Okay, Mary. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, how many people were there in Ohio that were actively trying to find slaves to take back so that they could make money?
That's very hard to say. I mean, a lot of it was, like mentioned Jennings, who was a slave hunter and did roam around Ohio looking for people to capture. And he usually had several people with him, but he was also a landowner and had his own place to run. You don't know the names of very many of these people. There's a guy named DeCamp that was one. I think that's kind of a good thing that these, nefarious creatures, we don't know their names. I don't think they deserve to be remembered by history. They're kind of these anonymous figures that are in these stories. But it's hard to say because, as I said, we particularly hit hard upon the U.S. Marshals that, really relish the idea of being slave hunters. And those we do know their names, but they, once it became their job to hunt slaves, as I said, some of them really embrace that and love the idea of tracking down these men and women and children. And others, as I said, they resigned their commission. They weren't going to be, slave hunters. So a lot of people saw it as a get rich quick scheme. We've got some of those we mentioned in the book where, it's an opportunity. They'd, in Cincinnati, they had that a lot down by the waterfront. They tried to lure, these black men onto the boats and get them over into Kentucky. And they even had one operation down there. It had the basement of the house was all set up to hold these people they had captured. So more questions.
I was gonna say Mary's the only one I saw with the hand up.
Well, I saw a bunch of them and now I don't see them.
Uh,
Oh, that's
They gave
weird.
up.
yeah.
Donna's.
Any
is up.
other questions?
Well, this is Elaine. I'll ask another question.
Sure.
You said, I thought you said in the Constitution that it said all new states would be free states. And then
No,
later,
not in the Constitution.
oh,
That was in the Northwest Ordinance.
okay.
Everything that was carved out of the Northwest Ordinance.
So later on, it became sort of, tit for tat. This state would become free. This state would become.
Yeah.
So how did
And even agreements that they had, they started violating. So
okay.
everything they agreed to, they started threw out the window as they were negotiating this. And one of the things that is really crucial in understanding, how we dealt with slavery is the fact that you think about it, our government was ruled by the South for, like through the first 13 or so presidents. They're all Southern people. They're all people of the South. And most of them were slaveholders. And the Supreme Court was ruled by Southern justices. And so when you get to the what is it, 3/5 or 2/5? There's, you hear about, the Americans were only valued as 2/5 or 3/5, I forget which, of a man. That's 3/5. Thank you.
Just over.
Yeah. The critical thing to know about that is if they had been valued as one whole person, that meant one whole vote. That meant the South would get more representation based upon the number of slaves they had. Instead, they were getting 3/5.
It was beneficial to the North.
It was beneficial to the North to keep that figure as low as possible, because if it had been 100%, 5/5, they would have had more voters, and there's no guarantee we ever would have been able to. We wouldn't have fought the Civil War because there wouldn't have been the will for it. The South would have had all the votes. They wouldn't have had the
all the representatives.
Yeah, because of all the representatives they would have gotten, because they were counting slaves as each slave as one whole person.
But
Yes.
Dave, also, it benefited the South because if they had allowed a black man to have a vote, then he would have a vote. They didn't want him to have a vote.
Well,
Right.
they weren't going to get the votes
So by
anyway.
making him 3/5, it made him ineligible for a vote. And that's how the South was able to control it too. Because they didn't want to give the slaves, the black
you're
man,
cutting
the
out.
vote.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but they weren't going to
Both
get the vote
ways.
anyway
It works
because
both
under the
ways.
Constitution, they weren't citizens yet.
Right, right.
Yeah,
But wasn't it also, I
Yeah.
remember you
yeah,
showed
they weren't citizens yet, so they
that-
couldn't vote.
that Texas was part of the South. But I
That's where
remember
I
they
see
were
it.
saying
Okay.
that when Mexico wanted to invade,
Okay.
I'm sorry? No, I'm talking,
Yeah.
when Texas wanted, they talked about Texas wanted to be part of the United States. But from what I've read, and I got through, our TTN on Unpacking Whiteness workshop, what happened was that if they had stayed as part of Mexico, Mexico had banned slavery. And the people from the South were moving into Texas and they wanted to keep their slaves. And if they were under Mexico, they would have lost their slaves. So that's why they wanted to be part of the United States and stay part of the South so they could keep their slaves.
Yeah.
Hmm.
The interesting thing about Texas too is they were given the option as coming in as 5 states.
I mean, because of their size.
Yes, which would have really been awful.
Wow.
Yeah, so this was very much a chess match that was going on between the North and the South, and the North won in the long run, but it cost a lot of blood. Yeah. Another
David,
question.
I have a very off-topic question. Can
Okay.
you tell us what exploding stove is all about?
Yeah. Number of years ago, my wife was doing publicity for the Big Apple Circus in New York. She needed a name for her business. And so we came up with Exploding Stove because it was that's what we called the business, is Exploding Stove. And we just kept it.
You were having some tech issues.
You-
I know it was because of the circus, but we lost you for a second.
Yeah, I think it's on our end, but you're frozen. So if we look kind of puzzled every once in a while, is there another question? There's movement anyway. I don't see.
Yeah. Yeah, you've been frozen a couple of times. I don't think they heard it all about why exploding stoves. The Big Apple Circus, but then exploding stoves was what?
Sometimes helps, but rarely.
Yeah.
We've turned our camera off because that sometimes helps, but we might just be in a hole. It might just be done.
Yeah. Right now, everything's kind of freezing intermittently. I don't know what it looks like on your end.
Same.
I can hear you pretty good right now.
You can hear me? Okay. Do you have any other questions or anything else you'd like to talk about? I was about to say, I really like Ripley, Ohio.
Oh.
And if you're at all interested in the Underground Railroad, I urge you to go to Ripley and just spend the day there. Because not only do you have the John Parker House and the John Rankin House, you have Red Oak, which is just outside, which is an old churchyard where a lot of interesting things had. If you go to the Parker House, the docent there, Dewey Scott, has written a nice little booklet that guides you to like 29 different Underground Railroad spots within Ripley. And because it's one of the best preserved Ohio River towns, certainly in our state, there's a lot to see there of old architecture, and it's just kind of delightful, but also a lot that has relevance to the Underground Railroad. And you can stand there and, at John Rankin's and look across into Kentucky and try to imagine, could you see a candle that far? Because he supposedly had a candle as a beacon. But that's one of the interesting places to go. In fact, we talk about it in our new book, which will be out in March, called Original Ohio, which is about 21 towns in Ohio that are historically significant that you can still visit and actually see something of the original community. And so Ripley's one of those towns. Yes.
I had a question about reparations while you were answering someone else's question. So I looked it up and I was surprised to see that the whole issue of reparations, or the first recorded case, it says, of reparations for slavery was in 1783, which really surprised me. I wonder how much, whether that issue has come up in your research, because it's, it's been an issue, obviously, for such a long time, rather than something recently, thought about.
Yeah, it's one of those things. We've been asked very little about it when we've been out talking about any of our books. We were contacted, I don't know, probably when this one came out, because they were having some kind of a rally in Akron or someplace. They wanted to know if we would come to. But I haven't heard anything more about it since then. It's one of those things, that if you take the broad view of slavery, there's not too many people that probably have never had members of their family that weren't enslaved by somebody. It was such a part of history for such a long time. I look at it from the standpoint, I'm glad we didn't have one more person killed in the Civil War, because that would have been my great grandfather, and I wouldn't have been around. But he and his three brothers were Germans just off the boat, got swept up in the Civil War, and two of them didn't make it any farther than West Virginia before they were killed, and he made it through the rest of the war. But it certainly would have had an impact upon my life if my great grandfather had been killed. But I think it's important more the lessons you learn from it to just ensure that nothing like that ever happens again. And also, I think we always point out too, there's an awful lot of slavery going on right now. Throughout, they estimate 40 some million people are enslaved. And as I said, there's blame to go around. There's no nationality has hardly ever escaped slavery. So it's not an issue. I don't give a whole lot of thought to it. I'm more concerned about trying to get the history straight. We're concerned about things like we write in the new book about how it's people are always looking for underground railroad houses, and there's very few of them that you can really build a strong case for being an underground railroad house. They usually just fall back on oral tradition and even the oral tradition doesn't seem to go back very far. But the houses generally are of abolitionists, people who are known to be abolitionists, but that doesn't guarantee they were underground railroad houses, because not all abolitionists were in favor of the Underground Railroad. They were Quakers, they were torn on violating the law, so they might not do that, but preserve the history that's there, and make sure you get it straight. We were really down on ghost tours. People that have legitimate structures that have history to them, who then go out and cater to the ghost tour, crowd, come in and, we'll do a seance and we'll communicate with these dead spirits of the, of the runaway slaves and things. I mean, I hate that kind of stuff. It's it really galls me to have people do that, to misuse history in that fashion. And also where they deliberately distort history. And so we try to debunk as much of that as we can.
So David, and Elise, I want to
Yes.
thank you so much for your presentation. It seems like everyone really enjoyed it. On behalf of the Ohio chapter of the Physician Network and all the other members who attended, thank you. It was really enjoyable and informative. And maybe we'll
Well,
have you
thank
back
you
again.
very much for having me. I enjoy talking. This is my preferred format for doing this kind of stuff, because I like to walk around and, and address people personally and bring them in. So it's very hard for me to do, focusing on this small screen. But I still welcome the opportunity, and I can see your faces, and that's good, because I've done a number of them where I haven't seen anybody. I haven't looked at anybody the whole time. And and I learned from this. I learned about your organization, which I'm happy to do that as well. Yeah, so if you want me back, and hopefully Elise, once she's well, to do any other books in the future, we're here. Mary
Sounds
knows where to
good.
find us.
All right, wonderful. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well done.
Really enjoyable.
Yeah. See you next time.
Okey-dokey. Bye-bye.
Thank you.